Hello, everyone. I'd like to start by asking a simple question. How do doctors heal? In the cut and thrust of a busy teaching hospital, like the one where I work in Oxford, you could be forgiven for thinking that storytelling is the very last thing on a doctor's mind. We are far too busy doing our jobs, often with time running out. We are running crash calls, cardiac arrests, major hemorrhages, making life and death decisions all of the time. But in fact, storytelling has a unique importance in medicine, and that was recognized back in the late 19th century by someone who is widely regarded as the father of modern medicine, a professor called Sir William Osler. Osler urged his medical students and his young doctors in training to learn by seeing and, crucially, by talking to patients. He once wrote, "Just listen to your patient. He is telling you the diagnosis." And those words are every bit as true today in the 21st century as they were when he wrote them. For all the high-tech wizardry of modern medicine, the scans, the genomics, the molecular analyses, all those array of technologies at our disposal, actually, the way a doctor invariably figures out what is wrong with a patient is simply by paying very close attention to what they tell us. And so storytelling, you telling us, your physicians, your own narratives of illness is incredibly important in medical diagnosis. But there's another much more fundamental way in which stories matter in medicine, and it's something that was encapsulated beautifully once by Philip Pullman, the author, himself no slouch at telling stories. Pullman once said, "After nourishment, shelter, and companionship, stories are the thing we need most in the world." Nowhere is that more true than in a hospital, where what heals is not only our drugs, a doctor's scalpel, it is smaller things too that matter. Holding someone, hearing them, making sure they know that they're being held and heard. I think, for me, stories are important because before I became a doctor, I was a television journalist. I made documentaries, and so I told other people's stories for a living. But now as a doctor, my job is to listen very closely, very attentively to my patients' stories and try with a team to help shape those stories for the better. That's the essence of what we all do in medicine. I'm a palliative care doctor, and so I specialize in looking after patients who are at the end of their life. And we all know that the beginnings and the endings of stories are often their dramatic high points. As with birth, so too in death, great intensity of emotion tends to dominate. It's therefore incredibly important that as palliative care doctors, we try to get that experience of dying for our patients as right as it is possible to be. And that means more simply than the absence of symptoms such as pain and distress. It means trying to ensure that a patient's end of life has grace and dignity. And I think something that's incredibly important, which we learn early on in palliative care, is a person's death is not actually the end of their story, because that story and the manner of a patient's dying lives on in their loved ones. It has a life of its own after the death of a person. I think, for me, a very powerful recent example that I heard of a story in medicine came from the Royal Marsden Cancer Hospital in London, one of the foremost centres for cancer treatment in this country. It came from one of the play specialists there, a woman who was wrestling with the challenge of trying to care for children who face radiotherapy for their tumours. And there's a particular problem for these children, which is they have to undergo the treatment alone inside a radiotherapy machine where, of necessity, they're separated from their parents. And so they face a loud, distressing, threatening machine by themselves. It's a very challenging and frightening experience sometimes for children. To cope with this challenge, the play specialist invented something very simple but very ingenious, and she called it magic string. The magic string was a ball of multicoloured twine, one end of which the child could hold, the other end of which could thread underneath the door out of the room and be held by the child's parent. She had invented a literal story that was simultaneously a narrative story, a narrative thread, a story that child could tell themselves that even though they were alone and cold behind a lead-lined door, still they were being loved and held and cared for by their mother or father. A very powerful idea. A hospice, like the wonderful place where I work, is often seen by members of the public as a precipice. People fear that once you cross the threshold, all you will do is plummet downwards. There is nothing left for you to experience but the experience of dying. And I was recently struck by this when I met a new patient for the first time, somebody who was a huge Star Wars fan and who happened also to have terminal cancer. He said to me when he first met me, somewhat ruefully, "I've always thought of this place as the Death Star." And we smiled. Of course, in one sense, he was absolutely right. There is no escaping the fact that many of the patients who come to our hospice will not leave, although that's by no means always the case. But I think what strikes me in the work I do is not my proximity to death, it is the sheer quantity of life that I observe every day at work. And not just ordinary humdrum everyday life, I'm talking about the very best bits of life: love, compassion, courage, selflessness, all those things we see in abundance. And in fact, so often as a patient approaches the end of their life, these things predominate in a way they never have done at any other point in their life story. It's truly remarkable. I'd like to share with you a story from the end of my very first week as a palliative care doctor that I think exemplifies what I've just described. And it took place one busy Friday afternoon. I had been caring all week for a gentleman in his 70s who was dying of cancer. And on that Friday afternoon, he had taken a turn for the worse. He was clearly in the last, probably short hours of his life. His wife, whom I'll call Linda, was incredibly distraught when she realized he was dying and she had so little time left with him. Her cries reverberated through the entire ward. She could only scream her distress. It was that intense for her. And I went into the room to try to help. I was confronted by a woman consumed by grief, by the patient himself now deeply unconscious, and probably around 10 or 12 other family members, all of whom were crammed into this chaotic environment. And I had to decide how to proceed. I thought very quickly, and the first thing I did was ask all of the other family members to leave the room. So now just the three of us were left: Linda, her husband, and me. And I placed my hands firmly on her shoulders to try and distract her from her grief. She looked at me, and when I caught her eye, I said to her, "Linda, would you like to say goodbye to your husband as his wife? Would you like to lie beside him now to say goodbye to him?" And she was confused. She said, "How? I don't know how I can do that." And if I'm honest, at that stage, I wasn't entirely sure how she could myself. There were high sides on the bed, and there wasn't very much room for someone else. I just knew we had to try. And so with several of the nurses, with several of the nurses, we carefully manoeuvred the patient to one side of his bed and created a small space where his wife of nearly 50 years, a woman who had met her husband when she was 14 years old and had spent her entire adult life married to him, now lay beside him. She kissed him, held his hand, whispered that she loved him, stroked his cheek, cried, did everything she wanted to. I withdrew, gave them some privacy, and when I returned, after about half an hour, her whole family had gathered in the room as well. And just moments after I entered the room, he inhaled, his chest rose as his lungs filled with air, and he exhaled one final time, and he died in the arms of the woman he had loved for so many decades. I share that example because for me it exemplifies two things. First and foremost, that even in a hospice, a place that is so synonymous for many people with fear and taboo and darkness, there is more than enough love to light the rooms. In fact, I'm struck over and over again by the fact that in my work in palliative care, it is for all the pain and suffering and grief that accompanies the work we do, actually it is love from which all of that stems, and it is that predominates at the end of someone's life. I have learned, as surely as I know anything through this work, that grief is the form love takes when somebody dies. It is what binds us. It is our magic string, perhaps not literal, but certainly metaphorical. And the second thing I have learned is that here in this example was the very best of healthcare. We saw here a medical team of doctors and nurses doing their utmost to strive beyond the mere statistics, the hard facts of medicine, and reach out to the meanings and the emotions that matter to a patient and their family at the end of life. There is a wonderful quotation here from the great poet Maya Angelou, who said, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel." All doctors, not only palliative care doctors, I believe must strive to hear those words and heed them. We must do our utmost to ensure that our patients feel our care for them. And we do that by hearing their stories. We listen, we respect, we ensure that a patient does not feel they are ever abandoned, they are ever by themselves left alone in medicine. So to return to my original question, how do doctors heal? I think we have an extraordinary array of technologies in medicine at our disposal to achieve that healing. We can enhance and prolong life in so many ways. We can use antibiotics, chemotherapy, organ transplants, so many different technologies, and yet all of us will die. We will all reach a point in our life where the moment for all of that has passed. We have lost it. There is no room anymore for prolonging or enhancing. The message I take from working as a palliative care doctor, though, is this: there is always capacity for healing, even when there is no option for cure. Even when we can't enhance, we can't prolong, we can still heal. And that's because healing, fundamentally, at its core, is about our shared humanity. It is about ensuring we remain connected to someone, especially in the final days of their life, so that they never feel alone. We always ensure there is a magic string, and it is always embracing all of us. The great beauty of that aspect of healing is, of course, that it is in no sense the monopoly of doctors. We can all do this. You can do this every bit as much as I can, as any of us can. And I think you will all, at some stage, if you haven't already, face a situation where you are grieving, you are hurting because you are losing someone. And perhaps in that grief, you can hold on to two facts. The first is you can heal. If you can maintain that human connection, if you can embrace rather than shrink away from the pain of having to lose somebody you love, you have the opportunity to do something remarkable and healing right when it matters the most, right at the end of somebody's life. And if you can remember somehow, although it's hard, that pain you are feeling exists because grief is the form your love is taking as you lose someone, as you see them die, then perhaps that can give you strength at that time. If you're able to do that, you're doing something remarkable, because at the end of somebody's life, when they need that human connection and all the healing that encompasses more than at any other time, you are being their magic string, and we can all do that. Thank you very much.